I'm good till whenever.
All right, okay. Fantastic. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Good morning. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing fantastic, gentlemen. Other than my, as we've been saying, we have some technical issues, and that's why we're going a little late this morning, but that's okay. When it goes out of the podcast, it'll be cleaned up. Guys and gals out there, Warrior Nation, today we'll be joined by Will Tanner. Will is the co-founder of the American Tribune network of properties. He focuses on writing and speaking about history's relationship to the present, particularly the civilized world before the guns of August and the post-colonial history of Southern Africa. And in that regard, Will, you and I share a very common niche, sir.
Glad to hear it. It's a small set of people that do that.
I know, you know, and I tell people all the time, like, you want to understand now, you've got to go back to Southern Africa. There's so many lessons there. I know Will, my good friend Will Wood and I talk about the economic disaster that was Zimbabwe. Quite often on our Monday, Mr. Tanner, is kind of our economic and sit rep show. Okay. And then Fridays we interview guests, but I think it's very appropriate that you're on today. And I just want to thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yes, thank you so much. This is going to be great. I'm really looking forward to getting more educated than I was able to get from your pieces that Rich sent over.
Great.
And with that, the show is going to be kind of, are we all Rhodesians now? And even what does that even mean to say that? Mr. Tanner, and I'm going to say that because you're both Will. That's okay.
Sounds good.
Mr. Tanner, tell us about what does that even mean to say, are we all Rhodesians now?
Yeah. So for those who don't know, the 10,000 foot view of Rhodesia is that it was this successful, very prosperous country in Southern Africa that, because of Western ideologies that dominated the second half of the 20th century, was destroyed for no real reason other than that it was prosperous and a rebuke to the egalitarian communist present, or at the time present. And it was destroyed, and it's horrible to live in now. It's now called Zimbabwe, which we all know of the hyperinflation, the just tyranny of Mugabe, the land expropriation. And so I think it's an appropriate question to ask, are we in America, particularly heritage Americans or people who believe in the America that the founders believed in, are we Rhodesians now because our country similarly is quite prosperous and is built on these old ideas and is now being destroyed because those old ideas and the men who represent them conflict with the present ideology?
Well said. Very succinct, sir. Will, anything to add on to that?
No, I'm just looking forward to digging into this history and see what parallels we can draw and hopefully as a society head off.
Yeah, so I think this is also important to kind of get up. You know, three white guys having a conversation about Rhodesia send chills up people's spines. So let's get this out of the way right now. Why is it so challenging to have an honest dialogue about Rhodesia in the 21st century, especially among heritage Americans? And I will say, you know, I took this right off the Indiana State University website. Quote, Rhodesia was a brutal and short-lived era of white minority rule in what is now Zimbabwe, marked by vicious repression and restrictions on the most basic rights of the Black majority. It just screams out white supremacy. It screams out racism. It screams out extreme hatred toward Black people, toward African natives, the people of Zimbabwe, end quote. And that's a Zimbabwean who has moved to Calgary to work at a nonprofit. But this gentleman says that that's what I associate Rhodesia with and what Rhodesia stood for. Do you think that's an accurate assessment, Mr. Tanner?
No, that whole passage was historically illiterate. There was no apartheid system in Rhodesia, nor any similar system, really. Instead, the way the Rhodesians operated the government, and just Rhodesia operated, was off a modified version of property voting, kind of like in America before Jackson or Britain before the first Reform Bill. To vote, you just needed to show you had a certain amount of Rhodesian property. That could be a house or farmland or a Rhodesian company, whatever, any amount of property there. I forget what the exact numerical value was, but something reasonably attainable. And
can I speak onto that, Mr. Tanner?
Yes, please do.
Because I did a little bit of, just to give everybody. So what Will is talking about with property voting, in the Constitution, I think it's 1961, they had an A roll and a B roll. So let's talk A roll. So when we say that oh God, it must have been really hard to get on the A roll, which is full voting rights. Not really. And this was regardless of race, regardless of gender. I did the conversions for you. The Constitution said if you made $11,207 in 2024 US dollars, or it depends on how you do the currency exchange. Let me give it for the highest one. If it's a 2.8, it comes out to be $31,000. So if you made $31,000, or you had real estate of around $65,000 or more, or all that could be waived if you had a college education, or if you were a black chieftain or headman, you automatically get on the A roll. And then we can talk about B roll. But I mean, this is not what it sounded like to people like, oh my God, it's white minority rule. You have to have land. You must have to have 100 acres. No.
Yeah.
So to put that in context for today, a minimum wage job would get you on the A roll.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah. And then we could talk about I think there's a brilliance in this system. And I don't know if you feel the same way, Mr. Tanner. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I'm all for it. I think the West's period of greatness was really a result of similar property voting. The conversions are different. I think the amount of property you would have had in America translates into around like $12,000 in property today, which isn't much, but it screens out the incompetent. If someone can neither earn a relatively paltry amount of wealth or hold on to it if they inherited it, I don't really see why they should be voting or having a hand in the government, because how are they going to steward our national wealth or our national prosperity if they couldn't steward their own?
Well, it goes back, and that goes back to, I believe it was Franklin that said the republic is doomed when, I'm paraphrasing here, when the republic is doomed when people realize they can vote themselves a raise from the national treasury. And that's essentially what we have going on now.
And similarly, John Adams noted, I forget the exact quote, but he said, someone who doesn't have property will have a master other than property and will obey that master's wishes. That's paraphrasing, but you see that as well today. How many voters are not net income taxpayers and just vote for the welfare programs that control them to be forever expanded, whatever the cost to the treasury? So the Rhodesian system largely screened that sort of thing out.
And I think it's important you said net payer of income taxes, because everybody pays in, but a lot of people get it all back through various programs there as well.
Exactly.
So,
Another thing I think is important is this idea of universal human suffrage. I think that most Americans or 21st century Western just assume it's always been that way. But even in the UK, full universal suffrage didn't come around, I think, until like 1928.
Right.
I mean, women weren't even given full voting rights in Switzerland until 1990. So I think there's a misnomer that this is just the way it's always been. No, this is a relatively new concept. This is a 20th century concept for universal human suffrage. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. In Britain, for example, it was only the first reform bill of the 30s that really even expanded it to the middle part of the middle class. And then much later in the century was expanded beyond that. In America, similarly, you had a lot of restrictions. So if you look at the period of greatness that really began the West, whether it was the earlies of Victoria's reign or America under the era of good feelings, that era was dominated by restrictions on universal suffrage to try and make sure that competent people were in charge. And it's very recently that that's been done away with. And similarly, very recently that our period of decline has begun.
Yeah, so we talked about an A roll. Well, let's talk about the B roll. And again, these are regardless of race, regardless of gender. To get on the B roll, you got to be 18 years of age. A roll was 21. There is a minimum income requirement of roughly $19,000 in today's. I'm sorry. The minimum income was around $10,000 in today's dollars, or real estate of around $19,000. And these were reduced to comical levels if the voter had a 2-year degree and a little bit of higher education. So I think there's a brilliance in this system. And to take it just the final step, Will, and then anything you want to add on to the voting, because I think it's incredibly important, was the A roll counted for 80% of the national elections, and the B roll counted for 20% of the national elections. Whereas in the district elections, the smaller local elections, it was reversed, with 80% of the B roll getting a bigger say and 20% of the A roll. And I thought that was pretty doggone brilliant. You have a say in your local politics, but not so much at the national level. What do you think on that, Will?
As I was getting ready for the show, Mr. Tanner, I recently did a family trip. I'm from Wisconsin, and we did a family trip down through Tennessee and met Rich and his wonderful family in person for the first time then. And it really changed my opinion about the Civil War, going and seeing the sites and realizing these things and the things Rich has taught me about it. I'm finding the same thing with Rhodesia. If you would have asked me maybe months ago what I thought of Rhodesia, I would have had a different perspective. But now learning more, it's funny how when you learn more, your opinions change. I think there's brilliance in this, in the I think there's brilliance in this in the simplicity of it and the logic of it.
Mr. Tanner.
And
Yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt. My beautiful bride just handed me a note. My power is going out at 9 a.m. So I guess I have a hard out of 9 a.m. now. So sorry about that, guys.
Sounds good. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, agreed. I think if you really look at what the Rhodesians were trying to accomplish with a lot of what they did, particularly under Ian Smith's time as prime minister, it was trying to help the Black population get more involved and become more prosperous. There are interesting things on that note. One is the Minister of Agriculture, the Duke of Montrose, set aside half of the arable land in the country that wasn't plagued by the tsetse fly to be reserved for Black ownership if they wanted to buy it. There were mixed results with that, but they still had it. Similarly, Ian Smith invested a lot in the villages, and because of that, had very good relations with the tribal chiefs. And pairing that with the B-roll voting for local elections, I think you see a lot of what they were trying to do was far from being white supremacists, like people claim. It was trying to lift a nation out of poverty. And in that, they quite succeeded. They not only made the most prosperous country, or one of the most prosperous countries in Africa and one of the most developed, but they had the highest standard of living for Black people in the continent. And so they're accused of being all these horrible things, and undemocratic is one of the typical accusations hurled at them. And it's the only one that's kind of true, perhaps. But the result of that was success. It was prosperity. It was living standards. It was all these great things. So I think the criticisms of Rhodesia largely missed the facts on the ground, both in terms of what the system actually was and what its results were.
Yeah, I absolutely couldn't agree with you more on that. Just as a little quick vignette on this, I forget if it was Ian Smith. This is like in the 50s. And they have an opera house in Salisbury, which is the time was the capital of Rhodesia. And in the opera house, they had segregated seating for Blacks. And he's like, well, why are we doing this? And they're like, well, it's just always been this way. It's like, no, get rid of this. The kind of person that's going to come to the opera, put on a suit, have means and the wherewithal to come here, needs to have full seating wherever they want. And I think, to me, that's people hear Rhodesian, they think apartheid. Which is absolutely not what was the case here at all. You could climb as high as you wanted to. Now, was it? Let's get the problem out of the way. Was there restrictions as to where you could live in Bulawayo or Salisbury? There were Black neighborhoods, high-income Black neighborhoods and high-end. We had the same thing with red line real estate here in the United States. Mm-hmm. So to look down our moral supremacist nose on this is missing the point.
Right.
Let's welcome a couple folks onto the show. We got Craig Holland over in the UK. Good morning, Craig. We're going to talk about the treachery of the UK relative to UD. Dr. Gordon Botson is on. Rasmic is on, gold member. Ted, Don, Gerald, Mark is on over there in Australia. Thanks so much for watching today's show. Donald is on out there in Montana. So, Will, this is probably when people think of Zimbabwe, one of the first things they think about right here.
Yep. I normally don't like to brag, but I am a trillionaire. 2 of them with shipping cost me $26. So I typically don't like to brag like that, Mr. Tanner, but it's just one of those things. It is what it is.
Well, when you're 100 trillionaire, you have to let someone know.
That's true, and if only it wasn't monopoly money. And we can in past shows we've dug into how this happened after Mugabe took over, and the over farming of the land, poor management of the land, and the basically the cost of bringing fertilizer in to keep the land producing, even though it was being ruined, resulted in hyperinflation.
Well, yeah, I would lay the blame at the feet of the Reform Acts where they just stole the land from those. But I want to talk about this real quick because when you look at, and I'll have notes, a lot of notes. If you're listening to the podcast later, please go to AmericanWarriorShow.com. In the show notes for today, I'll have the documentaries, the books you need to read, all the things that I have accumulated on this topic, so you can dive as far as you like. But when we talk about the land that was given, you have Rhodesia. Well, and check me on this. I'm guessing probably at the height there were around 250,000 whites in a country of a few million blacks, right? Maybe 7 million blacks.
Yes, around that.
So you see that 5% of the population is dominating, right? And they have maybe a third of the land. Well, the problem with the land is, and this is something I read recently, and it kind of opened my eyes to it. When they crossed the Limpopo, the white settlers, and moved into what is now Zimbabwe and started creating a nation, the black farming population, whether that was Matabele or Shona, they literally lived in the Pleistocene era. I mean, they had no will, they had no written language. Their farming was done not with a stone, but basically a stick that they could use. So when I say that, my point I'm getting at is, they gave them the softer, loamy type soil, whereas the harder soil was used for modern agriculture implements. It could be done. It couldn't be done with them. If we would have flip-flopped it and said, okay, you can have these lands, it would have been the cruel whites that are coming in and disenfranchising people because they can't farm it. Not a problem. We're going to get. So I think that, again, everything doesn't hold up to historical scrutiny. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. There are other interesting things too, like speaking of the hyperinflation, it's a great example of not understanding the consequences of just horrible actions. I really don't get the impression that Mugabe understood that Rhodesia was growing tobacco and grain so that it could export it and earn foreign exchange and then pay the debts on its bonds and import things like fertilizer. He just didn't get that. So when he handed the farmlands to his supporters, none of whom knew how to farm in the modern way, whether that was with high-intensity agricultures or highly mechanized equipment that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a pop, I just don't get the impression they really understood all that was going on there. So then they stopped producing food and they stopped having the ability to export anything because of the land expropriation. And so because of that, you get the inability to pay the interest on debts, the inability to import anything without just trying to print vast streams of money to get something out of it. And so there are all these things where there was a reason that the Rhodesian government did things the way it did. And then Mugabe it's like throwing a rock in a pond and seeing the ripples, all the things that fall apart as a result. And the history of tobacco growing stretches back to the 1890s with the British South African Company trying to get settlers to move in. And so it's just interesting. And similarly, like you were mentioning, setting land aside for the black farmers, that was a conscious effort of the Rhodesian government under Ian Smith to make sure that continued in the modern era and they had farmland they could buy if they wanted to. And of course, he never gets credit for that. But it really does, I think, dismantle the historical narrative about Rhodesia being a white supremacist state.
Yeah. I just wish there was some parallel with excessive money printing and irresponsible government we could look at in modern day so we could apply these lessons. If only there was such a place.
If only.
Yeah.
So let me, again, I love to, you see million, billion, trillion, and those numbers, I think in the Western mind, just kind of people's eyes glaze over and they lose their punch. So let's put this in terms of something we can all understand. Seconds. Okay. 100 trillion seconds ago was over 3 million years ago. These are gigantic, astronomical numbers, folks. And when you see a little Zimbabwean kid holding $100 trillion note and he's received 3 eggs for it, that's the value. It's absolutely destroyed the currency. Now I think they trade on US dollars for the most part, or probably South African rand, I imagine. Will.
Yes, they do. And to put their hyperinflation into context, and as a reminder, everybody, hyperinflation, there is no real definition of it. The general definition is somewhere greater than 100% per month is the generally accepted number for hyperinflation. their inflation was so high at one point, something like 15,000%, that if you went to the store with your family to buy groceries, as soon as you pick something off the shelf, you would have someone go pay for it. Otherwise, the price would be higher when you went to check out.
Isn't that insane?
So,
Mr. Tanner, sir, getting back to the topic of, I think we've laid a little bit of groundwork, and I really appreciate your patience on that. When we say, are we all Rhodesians now? And I think Will did a good job of kind of teeing up the fact that we're seeing the same practices here that could lead to just some sort of destruction. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. The inflation example is interesting. If America is going to have hyperinflation, I think is a completely different question, just because we could have economic autarky if we wanted to, whereas the Rhodesians really couldn't. But I think the idea of throwing a rock at a complex system or tossing sand in the gears of a mechanized society is an interesting one, just because that's very obviously what our leaders are doing. I don't know if you saw this story with Elon, but they're prohibiting more SpaceX launches because of his political views in California. So he can't launch more. He can't expand rocket launches from Vandenberg Air Force Base. And it's just things like that. Like Elon needs to be able to launch rockets because that's the only real way the United States has access to space right now. And without access to space, we won't have communications. We won't have GPS. We won't have all these things that even our just abysmal regime relies upon. And I don't think they realize that. Somewhat like Mugabe didn't really think about the foreign exchange issue.
Well, Rich and I have talked about this in the past when talking about economics. We have a bunch of octogenarians running the country. Biden is an easy example of that. And I am as critical of them as anyone, but to an extent, I can understand as they look back at 40 years of service with big air quotes around that. You're dealing with someone who's like, well, this has always worked. Just keep doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get, younger folks, 30s, 40s, 50s going, they're going, no, this doesn't work. They're like, what are you talking about? It's always worked. See, it's still working. I'm still enriching myself. So I think that's going to be the big hurdle we have to face. And sadly, I think it's going to take years because it's that generational change inside inside the system. And I think COVID has accelerated that with the stimmy checks and all the other things we could dig into there.
Definitely.
So, Rhodesia, what made you get into this topic, Mr. Tanner?
This is probably a more convoluted story than most. When I was like 10, I was wandering around Barnes & Noble back before like Amazon was really a thing, at least I knew about foreign books, and found one that I think was supposed to be critical of Blackwater. Thinking about it now, is by a guy named Jeremy Scahill. But when I read it, I thought Blackwater was the coolest thing ever. I loved it. So I got into reading about Eric Prince through that, and through him found Soldier of Fortune magazine, just because private military contractors and Soldier of Fortune kind of go together. And through Soldier of Fortune, particularly the autobiography of Robert K. Brown, who founded it, I think his book's called Dancing with Devils. He talked about smuggling guns to Rhodesia through his local airport, just in duffel bags, so that he could arm the Rhodesian farmers. So just through that and kind of reading about the farmers fighting against communist terrorists, I got interested in learning about it. And it was kind of on the back burner of my mind until probably around the Summer of Love riots of 2020. And then just started reading more about it. I stumbled across Ian Smith's autobiography as well, The Great Betrayal, which is quite good. And similarly, books about the Bush War. Three Sips of Gin is my favorite, but there are a bunch of good ones. And just learning about how this society, which I've found I've read nothing that makes me see it as an objectionable society in really any way, whether it was their voting system, their economy, their willingness to fight communism. I think they're extremely admirable. And so I just kept learning more about it because of that.
Yeah, and I'll give a shout out as well. Will and I are in our mid 50s, and I was reading Soldier of Fortune in the 70s because that's the kind of kid I was. I was comic books of Soldier of Fortune, and I was dreaming of the day that I would be a mercenary fighting in sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah. So I spent 23 years in the Marine Corps, and there we go. But yeah, I agree with you. I always looked at it, until probably 20 years ago, I only looked at it from a tactician's perspective as a Marine Corps officer and what are the lessons I can learn, whether it's the Selous Scouts or Fire Force and some of the amazing operations they did. We can talk about some today, Dingo or Lund. They did some amazing things.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. But then I read The Great Betrayal or Better Harvest, which I think is what it released at in the United States, Ian Smith's book. And the others that I will put in show notes. I'll have a link to all the books I've read on Rhodesia, and they're pretty extensive. And then I kind of, wow, this is an amazing society, this community that tried to hold on. And my God, why didn't anybody do anything to help them? I mean, Zapu and Zanu that ultimately led the fight to the white folks there. I mean, they were communists. The Soviets backed Joshua Nkomo, his Zapu, and let's see, we had Zanu being backed by the Chinese, and of course that's Mugabe. And then when you look at Mugabe's a Shona and Nkomo was a Matabele, so you had all this tribal conflict that was a layer to it that I think the Westerners didn't understand. This ethnic stuff. What are your thoughts, Mr. Tanner, about I don't know, maybe the ethnic stuff, the Soviet stuff? Take us wherever you want, please.
Yeah, the Bush War, you mentioned the lack of aid for the Rhodesians. It really is insane. For example, the only countries that ever aided Rhodesia were Portugal under Salazar until it fell to the socialists in 1974, which really opened up the Bush War because then the Portuguese lost Mozambique, which became ruled by the communists. And then Israel aided Rhodesia for the 70s when it had a right-wing government, particularly providing weapons. And then South Africa kind of aided Rhodesia throughout the war, but was standoffish for most of it because South Africa thought by leaving Rhodesia for the wolves, it would have a longer lease on life, which in some respects proved accurate, but was probably short-sighted. But other than that, no one aided them. The British sent The British sent warships to patrol the port of Beira, through which it was in Mozambique, through which the Rhodesians were importing oil. America rammed sanctions through the UN. Jimmy Carter and his friend Andy Young, who is an Atlanta area civil rights activist, supported both Mugabe and Nkomo, but particularly they kept providing moral support for Nkomo even after his men shot down with surface-to-air missiles 2 civilian airliners that they knew were civilian airliners. And then when they crashed, they bayoneted the survivors to death. Women, children, it was horrific. And Jimmy Carter and Andy Young kept saying, oh, no, he's a great guy. It must have been an accident or something. It was just horrific. And so Americans apply their civil rights lens, or a lot of Americans do, particularly at the time, and say, well, because there are these white people who generally are in charge of the government and they're black people who generally serve as laborers for the farms, that means they're just racist and horrible and they have no redeeming qualities. They're like the Klansmen we're fighting, which is just absurd in every way. Ian Smith's government, even when it desperately needed men, would throw out American white supremacists who traveled to the state wanting to fight for it because it saw them as being unhelpful and not really understanding that the war was a fight against communism rather than a fight between white and black. Similarly, thousands upon thousands of black soldiers volunteered for the Rhodesian African Rifles to fight against the communists, and the black villagers would turn in communists who infiltrated the state to the Rhodesian security forces because they quite liked Ian Smith. The chiefs liked him, the tribes liked him. It was positive. And then, so with all that positivity, Mugabe got in charge and immediately set about just ruining it, whether it was the white on black strife or his genocide of the Matabele in the Gurukundi. It was just horrific and unnecessary. But it, I think, really shows the inability of democratic states like America or post-reform Britain to think about long-term survival strategies and the importance of Rhodesian resources, even whether it was what was underground or what they were growing from it. Rhodesia could have been a valuable ally in the fight against communism and really just a good state to support because of its redeeming qualities. But instead, because of the egalitarian push of the late 20th century and just the incorrect lens through which they viewed things, they turned their backs on it and refused to provide aid. And it was largely because of America and Britain's refusal to support Rhodesia or refusal to let it trade with other countries that the communists did destroy it, and that thousands upon thousands of people died and land was expropriated and famine followed. All that can be traced back to egalitarianism in America and Britain.
Oh,
And I'm finding a parallel there between, the Summer of Love and 2020. It was all about appearances.
Mm-hmm.
Never mind what the reality was.
Yes.
And of course, the media, in retrospect, looking back then, didn't do anybody any favors and actually look into any of these things. They just took it at face value, white versus black, and judged it off race, which by definition is racism.
Right.
And then, I'm seeing that with the BLM, they're minority. They must be right.
Right. And similarly to the Summer of Love riots, the impression of what happened is largely formed by communist apparatchiks in the media and government.
Mm-hmm.
What we think about, or what, not we, but what a lot of people think about Rhodesia is what the communists said, that it was an apartheid white supremacist
Mm-hmm.
state, none of which was true. Similarly with the Summer of Love, it was mostly peaceful, say the communists at CNN.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the Summer of Love, say the Bolsheviks at MSNBC, and all that stuff. The impression amongst the shall we say, low information part of the populace is really just dictated by the communists in charge. It's quite similar and quite unfortunate.
Yeah. Great stuff. If you're listening to the podcast in the future, go back and listen. I did 2 or 3 shows with Dr. John Cronin, who was a former Force Reconnaissance Marine who went over to Rhodesia and fought with the Selous Scouts in the 70s. I highly encourage you to read his book, The Bleed, as well. He wrote about his time in the Marines and in Rhodesia with the RLI and with the Selous Scouts. But we've had some great conversations with him. And what's interesting about Dr. Cronin is, if you listen to those shows, this is a man that went on to get his doctorate and is now a university professor here in, I believe, international politics and economics. So he's a wealth of information. And anyway, you used a word a moment ago, Mr. Tanner. I want you to clarify for those that don't habla, egalitarian. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. There are probably multiple definitions that I'll be missing the mark on. What I view it as is the idea amongst really Britain and America since maybe the Parliament Bill of 1911, and that got particularly strengthened after World War II because of the myths about that conflict, that all humans are interchangeable economic units, not only viewed as equal in the eyes of God, which is true, but equal in terms of capabilities in the eyes of the state, and that any differences in outcomes have to be leveled by the state because they are bad for some reason. So it's not only like the idea that anyone can do anything. It's not only the idea that you hear in school. It's like, oh, well, you'll be an astronaut if only you try hard enough. It's really the idea that the guy who murdered someone at a 7-Eleven could have been an astronaut if he had a better calculus teacher. And because he ended up murdering someone, we have to put communism into the curriculum at schools. It's a really odd thing, but you see it best in Rhodesia, where they said, well, it doesn't matter that theoretically everything is equal between people, where you can buy land if you want, you can become a roll A voter if you want. What matters is that per capita wise, more whites are in the roll A voters than blacks. And so that means that you're oppressing them in some way and have to be destroyed because of that. You see it also in affirmative action programs in American schools, or just similar things like that, where it's the if the outcome doesn't fit the ideology, then the outcome has to be destroyed.
As you were speaking there, Mr. Tanner, I pulled up the definition of egalitarianism, and this is from Wikipedia. It screams of dog whistles here. Is a school of thought within political philosophy that builds on concepts of social equity, prioritizing it for all people. The doctrines are generally characterized by the idea that all humans are equal in fundamental worth or moral status.
Yeah.
I could add one thing.
Please.
Another great example of this is going back ways, is the 1911 Parliament Bill in England, which destroyed the power of the House of Lords to veto legislation. Up until that point, it was largely understood that the Lords, though they might have their various flaws, which many of them did, operated as a check on democratic power, and that they had the right and ability to do it well, because they'd been bred since really William's conquest in 1066 to do so. Lord Birkenhead famously said of Lord Salisbury, whose family, the Cecils, had served as parliamentarians since Elizabeth I, that in humans as in racehorses, there's a great case to be made for the hereditary principle. And he was right. I mean, Britain was quite successful and was largely ruled by that collection of 1,000 or so families. And then it was destroyed. And pretty much since 1911, Britain has been declining. But if you look at why they rammed that bill through, it was for much the same reasons as Rhodesia was destroyed, which the idea of the Lords as a powerful entity that could not even propose legislation generally, though it did sometimes, but veto things that it saw as being bad for the kingdom, which it largely exercised responsibly as a power. That was bad because it was undemocratic and unegalitarian. It's just an interesting parallel, and I think gets to the root of the ideology, where it's really not good outcomes that they want, but they don't want disparate outcomes to occur.
Right. And I think, to me, if you say, like, what is the greatest lie the left ever told, it's probably the concept of tabula rasa. I mean, if you whittle it all the way down, in my opinion, it comes down to that, which is just not the case. I will never be able to play basketball as good as LeBron James. Let's be honest. He's almost 6'9", 55-year-old white guy. It's just not going to happen. So we have to realize that we all might be equal in the eyes of God, but the equality kind of stops beyond that.
Right.
Yes.
Michael Gentili has a question, Mr. Tanner. He says, does anti-egalitarianism provide a working framework for not making an effort to lift individuals from historical performing groups? Maybe he means underperforming.
Yes and no. I think Rhodesia is an example of anti-egalitarianism, where they wanted people to succeed and wanted to provide programs that gave them the ability to fully develop whatever human capital they had, whether that was providing more infrastructure like clean water and sewage for villages, or in setting aside half the land for the Black population, or half the arable land. So technically those things could lift up underperforming groups, just because it gives them the ability to fully develop their human capital. I think the difference between egalitarianism and anti-egalitarianism is that the egalitarians don't really care about good outcomes. They don't want good outcomes to occur, really. They just don't want disparate outcomes to occur. So they see things like the whites in Rhodesia tending to own more property than the blacks, at least on an average to average basis, as being bad purely because it's different. Whereas the anti-egalitarians, or hierarchists, whatever you want to say, those who operate under the hereditary idea, just want good things to occur. They like the idea that Rhodesia was prosperous. They like the idea that Britain used to be prosperous, and people have an ability to advance themselves socially within that framework. But it's really, they don't care that much about disparate outcomes occurring. If anything, they're just evidence that some people have more capital than others, more human capital developed.
Okay, let me, and I'll turn it over to you, Will, here in just 1 second.
Sure.
I want to give a little bit of a framework, especially for mostly of an American audience this morning. We got Craig, of course, is on from the UK, and we got some folks on in Australia and the Philippines. But for us heritage stock Americans, think about what we did to the Native Americans. Rhodesia, to me, learned from the mistakes of the U.S. in our relationships with the Native population. We stuck these people here in America on reservations that did have poor soil, did have poor conditions. We gave them smallpox blankets, for God's sake. We genocidally wiped them out in a lot of places. We had the Trail of Tears. You don't see any of that in Rhodesia. Or we the opposite, in that we took these people out of their tribal communities and tried to westernize them and beat them into submission for the Western dogma. Rhodesia absolutely did not do any of that. What I like about Rhodesia in that regard to how they dealt with their native population, we're talking about when the whites brought in modern medicine, it took a native population of roughly 300,000 and exploded into 7, 8, maybe 9 million, if anybody knows what the real numbers are. So that's one of the gifts that they brought there. You don't have to watch your child die from being bitten by a tsetse fly. You don't have to watch your child your wife die in childbirth. These are the things that they're brought. But if you didn't want to partake in Western society, please live on your crawl. Live with the way your forefathers did. Nobody's going to drag you out and make you learn. But if you want to get an education, you want to own land, you want to participate, please come out and do so. At least that's the way I look at it, Mr. Tanner.
Mm-hmm. And if I could add one thing on that,
please.
Relations between heritage stock Americans and Native Americans or Indians, whatever, remain bad. Even this morning, I saw a video of a bunch of Indians I think they were in multicam, where they might have been in the military National Guard, dragging Custer's flag through the dirt because they disliked him. Whereas in Rhodesia, that really wasn't the case. Most of the communists came from outside the country. Some came from internally, but really relations between the whites and the natives were quite good. And that remained even under Mugabe. In Rhodesia, there was no genocide of the European population like there was in Mozambique or like there was in the Congo with the Simbas. They were forced out and their land was taken by a thuggish government. And there were some bad things that occurred. Some people died. And it was awful. I'm not justifying it anyway or trying to diminish it. But there was no genocide because the native population really liked the Europeans. And you see that even today. And all the way up, it was really started in 2017 when the government deposed Mugabe and started allowing the white farmers to return and giving them their farms back. The natives were overjoyed. There are all these, heartwarming videos of the natives hugging them and cheering and being excited that they're coming back. So that's really very different than our relations with the Indians. And it shows the foresight of the Rhodesian government, I think, to try and make a situation in which there wasn't just the recurrent enmity between the different populations that were going to be there anyway.
And there were in the Rhodesian parliament, there were seats for the heads of the chiefs of these tribal areas. So again, you do have a say in what we do. And I just, when I look at this, I think what a brilliant, beautiful system they tried to create, and respecting the native ways and the native populations to get to live the way they want to live on their own property. And if you were a white man, you couldn't go into those native areas without a pass. Right. So again, it was respected. And I don't know. Will, did you have something to say, sir?
Yeah, going back to the egalitarianism, it really got me thinking about modern day America. I think it's a matter of patience. It's easy to say, well, we need to change this right now versus the American dream. My children have a better life than I have, and taking generations to build this up, and how that applies to Rhodesia, where there were opportunities for everyone, white or black, to climb that social ladder through hard work, whether it be, learning how to farm and then having a farm and then building said farm up. Whereas now, especially in America, we want equality or equity, I should say. We want equity and we want it now. And then that leads to short-sighted decisions by the politicians. It seems to always be the far left in that case. And then there's no value in that outcome. Just vote for more of that. Mr. Tanner, do you think that's on, or am I off on that?
The only thing you're off on is that Republicans tend to be just as bad on the egalitarian issue as Democrats. One of Ian Smith's comments in his book is, I forget the exact wording, but he says, really at the end of the day, we were betrayed just as much by the conservatives as we were by labor and the liberals. The problem with I define conservatism as the Burkean view of the world. He was the guy who was very anti the French Revolution. He saw it as just being abhorrent in every way. And I think conservatism is the idea that hierarchy and tradition matter, and that they're good. They're intrinsically good things because they're respectful of your ancestors and respectful of the future. It's the idea that an estate should be handed down from generation to generation, rather than spent to nothing so that you can go on a cruise or whatever it is. It's just that idea of continuity. And most Republicans and most Democrats, or in America or in Britain, most conservatives and most laborites are really hostile to that idea. I mean, how many Republicans were all in favor of tearing down the Confederate statues? Trump was really the only one who resisted that, and a couple members of Congress, but they got enough Republicans on board to overrule his veto and tear them all down and rename the bases. So it's I don't think it's a partisan issue. It's really a difference in outlook that's not respected by either party.
Michael Chantilly's got a great question here. This is, would some, and again, this P word that we're going to get to here in a second, I think is important to maybe for Mr. Tanner to discuss. Michael says, with someone who has no agency in building or administering the beautiful system, see it as anything more than paternalism. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, probably not. I disagree with the framing that paternalism is a bad thing. If on one hand you have a population that has managed to carve a modern, thriving, prosperous, wealthy society out of untamed veldt that before then had been inhabited by a few tens of thousands or maybe a couple 100,000 pastoralists who had really been stuck in the Stone Age for their entire history, I disagree with the framing that it's a bad idea to try and lift those people up and teach them how to use tractors and teach them how to use written language and teach them to believe in Christ. I think those are good things. And to some extent, it requires paternalism, but modern medicine isn't a bad thing. Anti-malarial drugs aren't a bad thing. Modern farming that you can use a tractor instead of backbreaking labor with a stick isn't a bad thing. It just requires showing people how to use that and developing a society in which they're encouraged to learn how to use those things and to use them. So no, they'd probably see it as paternalistic, but like I said, the tribal chiefs in the villages had quite good relations with Ian Smith and quite liked him. He of course was in the 60s and 70s rather than all of Rhodesian history. But I think Rhodesia was largely built on a similar operating principle where they taught people how to do that and did it. So no, it was paternalistic, and everyone probably saw it as paternalistic. They just saw paternalism as a good thing, as really paternalism had been seen as a good thing in Britain too before the Parliament Bill, where there are all these laborers who their main activities are drunkenness and beating their wives. We should probably teach them not to do that, which is paternalistic and demeaning. But they did teach them not to do that, and so it was better. It was better for everyone, because a lot of the horrors that occur when you just let people be off on their own, be completely atomized individuals, those things don't occur in a society that teaches people to be better. We have a hostile view of that now, or a lot of people do, but I just reject the framing that it's a bad thing.
Well said. So let's get back to this. I want to show Will's slides here. That's not the button I was looking for. Live show. There we go. So there's Kensington, and it goes back to are we Rhodesians now? You know, is this what's in store for us now? This is a Penn Station. It's a Palestinian protest zone. I think it beggars the question that we started today's show with.
Well, you know, and this is something I say tongue in cheek a lot as a smart aleck comment, but you know, those people on Kensington Avenue, and of course our hearts can go out to them on a human level, but each person there has many votes as the three of us and everyone listening now and in the future does. And that goes to, you know, Mr. Tanner's points about Rhodesia with, you know, property owning or income level, you know, some sort of hierarchy to have a say in how things are run. I'd be willing to bet that my view on what is good for the country and those people's on Kensington Avenue view of what's good for the country are vastly different.
Yes.
And that is, and Rich and I were talking yesterday, Mr. Tanner, and, you know, I guess my nature is to try and foresee problems and head them off. I think as an adult, you know, we're gun guys, and you know, in New York City, you can get a concealed carry permit. Here's the 57 steps to do so, but you can get one, right? And so I guess my hesitation with a system where, you know, you need to make a certain amount of money or have a certain amount of property, have a vote. I guess my only hang up within that is a system can be designed where over time, the power could become very concentrated. You know, it's to use that as an example, you know, right now it's the numbers which said basically a minimum wage job gets that done. But then there's a framework that could be done, you know, super majority in Congress to change that or something along those lines. But, you know, kind of like a concealed carry permit. Oh yeah, you can get a concealed carry permit. Here's the test you have to take. You basically have to be a world champion pistol shooter to pass it. Right. So, you know, that's something I think though that can be worked through. Do you have any thoughts on that, sir?
Yeah, there are two things. One, to go back to the paternalism thing real quickly, Kensington is a great example of what a paternalistic society doesn't tolerate. People forget, but many lords of the manor refused to let gin be sold on their estates because they saw how horribly it turned out in London. We're just, a rotting of the working class that led to horrible outcomes for people and abused children, abused wives, dead men. It was horrible. And so they refused to let that happen because they didn't think it was a good thing. Similarly, Kensington would be outlawed because it's awful. People shouldn't be using fentanyl and heroin on the side of the street, regardless of their personal autonomy. It's an intrinsically bad thing that should be prohibited. I think to the question of rights, I think it's important to look at historically who are the guardians of rights. Is it the people who pushed Magna Carta on King John, or is it the high-low ally, I forget who came up with the idea, but the idea that the high and the low, the king and the working class or just low population ally to strip people of their rights because they just hate the idea that someone might be better than them or might have more wealth than them. So I think if you look at a propertied system, it puts power in the hands of people that have a view of rights as a good thing because it protects them from above and below. And similarly, they think that others should have those rights as well. It works best at a societal level where everyone has these protections from those around them and the ability to limit their rights. It's a tricky question because there are obviously oligarchies throughout history that have done quite the opposite. Our present oligarchy is probably an example of one that wants to strip rights. Similarly, the same could be said of France or Britain or Russia. But I think generally over time, it's been shown that those with property are resistant to the socialist impulse because they don't want their property to be taken away. And so they're then willing to support those things that make it much harder for their property to be taken away, whether that's just legal rights in property that the Orient never really had and was a Western thing, or gun rights that let them defend their property, as arms have always been part and parcel of a free society, and they want to remain free so that they can keep their property. There's no perfect solution because there are always oligarchies, there are always democracies, there are always monarchies, all of which can be bad. That's the Aristotelian view of the different forms of government. The oligarchs, the tyrants, and the mob, and there are good versions of each. But how do you keep a good version is a much harder question. And I don't really think it stems from the system itself, but rather the morals of the people in it.
Yeah, I think outstanding answer, Mr. Tanner. And for those that are listening to the podcast, which is really what it's intended, the show is intended to be. Thank you for those watching live, but this is really going to be a podcast. And if you're listening to the podcast, you heard how we got here. Because as I said at the beginning, I think a lot of times historians, commentators, whomever, they kind of start in 1961 and then they flash forward to where did this UDI come from? Why is it, November 19th, for those that don't know, in 1965, Ian Smith and his cabinet took the unusual step. It's only been done twice, once with the United States and once with Rhodesia, by declaring independence from Great Britain. And they kind of look at that, and then they kind of get to the point that Michael's fixing to make in the question that I'm fixing to ask you, that a limited group of people in charge. But if you heard the 20 minutes preceding this show, where I explained to you how we got here and all the legal issues that went on to make sure this was done legally and appropriately when dealing with the Matabele, which is insane that we would ever even have these conversations. We are, if you remember from earlier in the show, part of the concessions was here's 1,000 Martin Henry rifles, 100,000 rounds of ammunition, a gunboat so you can kill your enemies with it given to the king of the Matabele for this concession, and 100 pounds a month, which equates to about $20,000 in perpetuity. And this was given to a man who never wore shoes, couldn't read or write, etc., had no will. So I think they were more than gracious in what they did. Craig says we call them traitors. Of course, Craig is a mistake. Thank you, Craig. So to Michael Gentili's question, do you think that a system based on the value system of a limited group of people is more easily corrupted, Mr. Tanner?
I think it depends on who that limited group of people is. The problem in modernity is that most of those in charge, the limited group that ends up having the ability to decide the state of exception, are plutocrats. They're people with no real connection to the land or its people or its traditions, but rather they just grew wealthy by some scheme or another. And so they don't really care. They have no concept of noblesse oblige. They have no concept of the societal good or of the traditions that led to the point we were at before them. They just really think about wealth as something to be earned and squandered. And similarly, they see society as something that can be spent down. That's you see the liquidations of America's social capital, whether it's private equity groups buying up kids' little league teams to raise the prices, or just in the continuing slide of letting crime happen because people aren't ready to stop tolerating it at a certain point. So that's what you get with plutocrats. And if that's the limited group, then it is indeed awful. I would disagree, however, that the idea that a group of property owners, whether that's the smallest yeoman with a few acres to farm or the largest lord with 100,000 that he's renting out, that group tends to resist the socialist impulse. And by socialist impulse, I mean not only the government control of property or expropriation of property has happened in Zimbabwe, but also all the tyranny that accompanies it, whether that's the confiscation of weapons, as Mugabe did, or limitations on free speech. And I think also if you just leave the franchise open to everyone, what you get is mob rule, like we see in America when it's not the plutocrats making a decision, it's the mob. And the mob is much more easily corrupted than someone who can trace his lineage back a dozen generations and to be connected to all the traditions of that. I think you can build a group through tradition and morals and good teaching that cares about things and wants them to continue and wants to resist the impulse of tyranny in whatever direction, in a way that you really can't if you just leave everything open all the time and view everyone as an atomized individual that's going to make a good decision. I think that's ridiculous and very historically untrue.
And to that point, Will, and then I'll turn it back over to you, sir.
Sure.
We see when Mugabe comes to power, it's not the summer of love. He immediately takes his North Korean trained unit and goes in and massacres 20 or 30,000 Matabele. Now, why does he do that? Because the Matabele used to run roughshod over the Shona people.
Oh, I think we lost Rich there, Mr. Tanner. I'm sure he'll rejoin us. I do, based on what you're saying though, there's a saying that Rich and I have used. Traditions are the answer to questions we've forgotten.
That's a great quote.
And I wish I could remember where I got it at. So some reading somewhere. Along those same lines, to Michael Gentili's question about the limited group of people. Of course, I mean we're all human, so things can go sideways there real easily. But I think it also goes back to the Second Amendment, right? I mean, people aren't going to be trampled on if they have the ability to defend themselves. And hence, the way that plays into how Mugabe, for one of the first things he did was take the firearms away, and then you can run roughshod over people. And I'm kind of the resident news and economics geek around this place, so. I'd be interested. Have you heard of the concept of the K-shaped recovery post-COVID?
No.
Okay, so the K-shaped recovery is when all the stimulus was sent out. Obviously, it went to basically everyone, but the people who had a little more foresight, a little more responsibility, saved, invested that money, and those who did not have that went out and spent that money. So in other words, most of that money wound up in the hands of people who were responsible in the end. And I think that goes back to your points about the responsibility shown by different groups of people. The people who came across that money easy, it wasn't in their hands very long, and it wound up in the hands of people who were responsible.
Right.
So bear with me 1 second. The joys of a live show here. I'm going to text Rich real quick and see if he's working his way back in. And let's see here if I can bring this up. Let's see here. No, because Rich has the control of it, unfortunately. Oh, I did get it there. Okay. This was a slide I came up with. Oh, you're back, brother. And to your point earlier, when I misspoke and made it more of a left-right thing versus all of them. Your point in your article about why Rhodesia matters, in all honesty, it had to be admitted that the conservatives were as much to blame as labor. Do you see that as today is what I generically call the establishment? And of course, I didn't come up with that. The left and the right elites in modern day America ganging up against anybody that doesn't conform with that. Are you seeing parallels there with Rhodesia, sir?
Yeah, I think it's great. Just to put a mental framework in, the establishment was even more of a thing in the 60s and 70s than it is now. I guess there was Nixon and Reagan, but they really went along with the establishment consensus on most things. The only real counterexample is Reagan in South Africa. But other than that, they just really did everyone did what the establishment wanted. And what the establishment wanted was, forever war is part of the Cold War abroad. And that really brought down the old world systems that had somewhat remained in place in the wake of World War II. And they all went along with it, including in Rhodesia and destroying it. Now you get a little bit of pushback from the populist parts of particularly the right. It's anemic on the left at best, and saying, well, I don't understand why we're doing this. We don't want to. And I don't see the point in killing Christians in Syria and Iraq as part of some scheme for oil, just as much as I don't really see the point in destroying European civilization in Southern Africa in the name of egalitarianism. So perhaps we shouldn't do these things. So you see this pushback that really frames the establishment, like you were saying, is this awful force that, for whatever reason, I think it's largely monetary and ideological, want to destroy civilization abroad. And also they want to destroy it internally. That's why they're importing all these people who hate us. They want the Venezuelan gangs taking over apartment complexes forever. So yes, I think the establishment then and the establishment now are horrible and great ways to view what was happening.
You back there, Brother Rich?
Can you guys hear me?
It's very you're about 2 by 3.
Okay. I apologize for that, gentlemen. Let's see here. All I was going to say is if Mr. Tanner can talk about the Constitution was changed in 1971, reducing the A and B role. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, much better now.
Okay, thank you. And when it was done away with, the blacks were given only requirements of 1/3 of what the whites were, meaning if you were a white person to vote, you had to make $30,000 a year. I'm just making a number up. Then you had to make less than $10,000 if you were a black African. And I say black African, the reason why I'm using white and black, because Ian Smith is an African. He was born and raised in Rhodesia. He's a Rhodesian. He's an African. He always considered himself an African. I'm very clear about that, of British stock. And I say that because the only way I can find to do it, because you have the Boers who were there since the 1600s. They've been there for 20, 30 generations. What else can you call them other than African? And so this moral stink, I think is, I don't know, doesn't make any sense to me. I want to get next to the next comment here on your article, Will.
Mm-hmm.
And there we go. Mr. Wood.
Oh, yes, sorry. This is from Why Rhodesia Matters from Mr. Tanner. The part I'm talking about here is anti-free speech and anti-Christian as to arrest those praying outside the abortion clinics. And this is, fundamental when we talk about the freedoms that come from this, is there is no protection in many areas for such activities that we enjoy here in the United States. And I think we take them for granted that that's the way it is all around the world. And I think this is also something, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Tanner, but this is something that would be resisted under a hierarchical system because of the traditions. And like we talked about, traditions are the answer to questions we've forgotten. If you can cycle forward on those, Rich, I've got some examples of this.
Absolutely.
And these are screenshots off of video. This is a lady standing outside an abortion clinic in the UK, and she says, "No, I'm not protesting." A second later, the police officer asks, "Are you praying?" 1 second later, she says, "I might be praying in my head, but not out loud." And then there's a gap there as they talk of about 18 seconds. This video is available all over Twitter. And she said, the cop says, okay, well, then you're under arrest against, upon suspicion of failing to comply with public spaces protection order. So I had to go look that up. And this is in the UK, and the PSPO is intended to prevent specific acts which would not otherwise be criminal offenses. And I was amazed how many of these public space protection orders are out there. There's 388 just in Wales alone. And that was back in 2017. So I bet there's more. So is it really a freedom if you can't use it?
Yeah. The one other way to phrase it, I think, is that the letter of the law matters less than whether those in charge care about the spirit of it. You see that now with them saying, oh, free speech or misinformation and hate speech aren't free speech, which is nonsensical. They're the very definition of free speech.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think what you see when you get mob rule is this just view of everything becomes political. Every aspect of life is politicized. And because of that, it's like in 1984 when they're just screaming about the prisoners of war or whatever, or it's just this like the public gets whipped into a fury about these random things that don't really matter, but that matter very much to the morality and just the horrors of the ruling class. And so the mob pushes it as well. It's that high-low alliance against the middle, and the middle is typically like normal people who just want to be able to say that Kamala is an idiot or whatever minor thing it might be. But it's outlawed now because it's wrong. It goes against the public's current wishes, which are forever changing, as we see constantly with the additions of letters to LGBT or just whatever it is. It's always changing every day, where you might be found in violation of it for something that you think is doing the politically correct moral thing. It's insanity.
Well, and to that point, I think that just drives silence, because the safest thing to do is just say nothing, do nothing, and only post puppy dog pictures on social media.
But silence is violence, Will.
But not then.
Unless you're praying silently.
Yeah, well, there's that. Okay, so there's three parts to this. This is getting more complicated. I'm going to need a flow chart here pretty soon. But I think that goes to, freedoms aren't really freedoms when they constantly change, and no one knows the rules except those who are changing the rules.
Mr. Tanner, this question comes from Don. He says, wouldn't their morality be the basis for any group's governance? How that morality was developed or instilled would be the critical input for the direction of their control. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's very true. I think when I use morality, I mean just the Christian Western view of right and wrong that everyone understood before the mid 20th century, probably, that you shouldn't do these things because they're bad. Whereas now morality is still probably the correct term, because it's what all these people believe to be right is what they push. But what they push is right is total individual autonomy and the breaking down of any tie that binds or any tradition. And so you can just do whatever or be whatever. And as long as it doesn't conflict with whatever things they continue changing, then it's fine. So that's why, they see Kensington as moral, because those people are expressing their autonomy through dying of fentanyl overdoses on the side of the road. Whereas they see praying outside an abortion clinic is wrong, because in praying but outside it, you're indicating that what the women are doing inside it is morally wrong, according to your Christian view rather than your progressive view, I guess. So yes, morality is always the basis on which the governing class and the mob decide what to do. I just think their current morality is an awful one. And so it doesn't really qualify as doing the moral thing to do whatever they do.
Is my audio okay now, gentlemen?
Yes.
Okay. Yep, you can do that.
Let's bring up morality again, since we're talking about morality. One of the things I have a problem with, so we talked about ZAPU being one of the groups, and ZAPU's military wing was ZIPRA. Of course, Joshua Nkomo led it. And as you already mentioned, Mr. Tanner, his group, ZIPRA, shot down 2 commercial aircrafts in Rhodesia, killing dozens and dozens of men, women, and children. And then the few that did survive were machine gunned and bayoneted and raped on the ground. And then Nkomo still gets to be part of the Lancaster House talks and other talks. It's like, how would that's like we let bin Laden come and try to have a say at the UN after he just, blew up the World Trade Center. Doesn't make sense.
Well, it
Well-
does make sense. They see it as moral that he was destroying Western civilization and killing white people. It's the same reason they glorify Malcolm X and people of that mold, despite them being terrorists. People forget Mandela was imprisoned for being a communist terrorist who helped blow up civilian buildings and kill the civilians inside them. They just see that as the moral thing and the correct thing. And so, of course, he has to be part of an agreement. He's doing what we wanted.
Well, you have to break eggs to make omelets, right?
Yeah.
I think Jeff's question gets to the heart of the matter. What does Mr. Tanner believe is the answer to the challenge of becoming another Rhodesia?
U.S. carrier groups. You see this in El Salvador, for example, with Bukele. He's a great guy. The obvious solution to El Salvador's criminal problem is not imprisoning the people forever, but having a more permanent way of dealing with the gang members who raped and killed untold numbers of people. I'm sure this goes on YouTube, so I don't want to say exactly what it is. But that's what a normal person would have done a century ago. Similarly, a normal person a century ago would have seen the state South Africa is in today, or the state Mozambique and Angola are in today, or the state that Zimbabwe, Rhodesia is in today, and said, well, we're not going to do this. We're going to raise an expeditionary force, and we're going to go suppress what's happening and bring civilization and order back to the place, because that's what's right. That's what we ought to do. It'll be good for everyone. You saw this, for example, with Executive Outcomes, sending a mercenary expeditionary force to Angola and doing the same to Sierra Leone to pacify it, because decades of civil war that leads to millions of deaths is a bad thing. But when they did so, the UN said, oh, you can't do that. You have to leave Sierra Leone. You have to leave Angola, which they did, and murder and mayhem followed immediately. So if anyone were to try and create something like Rhodesia anywhere, whether it was Boer rule in South Africa again, or just pacifying Mozambique and putting a competent government in charge, or doing the same to Angola or the Congo, or wherever, Colombia even, the problem with that is that almost immediately a U.S. carrier group would show up and bomb you into oblivion for not being democratic. Or they just pass sanctions and try and starve you to death, like we starved hundreds of thousands of children in Iraq to death with our sanctions on them in the 90s. So that's really the holdup.
Yeah, and to Jeff clarified, domestically, how do we keep from becoming another Rhodesia? If we're all Rhodesians now, is there any way to turn the tide on that, Mr. Tanner?
Yeah, there are two things, I think. One is that Orania is a great example in South Africa of a place that has not just survived, but thrived because of the chaos that surrounds them. And Orania is an Afrikaner-only town in South Africa. There are similar towns that are quite functional, and there'll be Zulu only or whatever. I forget their names because they're not really as relevant to my personal issues. But Orania and towns like it succeed when others fail because they have a driving purpose and are willing to exclude people who don't share that driving purpose with them. And because of that, they're successful and they thrive. They do well. You can live there and not be in constant fear of being destroyed. So I think that's one part of it, is moving to a friendly jurisdiction and trying to be around people who share your view of things and have a similar view of morality and tradition as you. Because even if the overarching governmental apparatus is against you, there's some resistance to that on the local level. And some things either might not be enforced or just might not be relevant. I think also the Rhodesia fell because the people in the West who could have helped it not fall believed the communist view of things. They said, oh, well, it's all these evil things for all these reasons that the Bolsheviks told us, so we have to shy away from it. You get much the same thing with American history, and the people who you would read about, whether it's George Washington or Jeb Stuart, who would show you that evil and progressivism can be resisted and ought be resisted, and that's the moral thing to do. Those people are looked down upon under the current progressive morality. And, I think it's important to overcome that internal hurdle, whether the hurdle is looking at George Washington as a good guy or looking at Ian Smith as a good guy. They both declared independence unilaterally, after all. And you just have to be able to overcome the accusations and lines of attack your enemies hurl at you.
Your points about Iraq are well taken, and I would only add on to that I think part of what plays into some of this international relations, and it's coming from my news and economics side, is the defense of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency, and what that what that means for us as Americans as well. So as usual, it's a witch's brew of
Right.
factors that play into all this. And so it's I think that because of how far reaching we are, because of those things and how vulnerable we are in those areas, speaking of the world reserve currency, it adds another layer on top of these points that you're bringing up.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
oh, just one thing on that point, because it's a great one. I probably misspoke with Iraq. I just meant you'd face similar sanctions and similarly destructive things. But also, any Rhodesia-like society would be an old world one. And that really means a hard dollar. Rhodesia had to do things just because of its situation. It couldn't have a gold-backed currency. It was just difficult for them. But if you saw the return of these things, you'd see the return of a hard currency of some sort or another. And the U.S. is, of course, very against that for all the reasons I'm sure you've talked about. So that's just another hurdle on top of everything else, is you can't have old world view of economics in modernity just because you'll be crushed for it, as I think anyone would be if they tried to push a gold-backed currency right now.
Agreed. Completely.
Yeah. Let's, Mugabe wrecking the country and doing everything he could to get rid of the white farmers. And there's several books on that. They'll be in today's show notes. So please take a look at that in the podcast show notes, I should say. But, who paid for Mugabe to go to the university where he got his education? It was a Irish Catholic priest who gave him the money. And then from there, he taught for a while, and then he goes to another university in Cape Town, and there he meets a bunch of Jewish communists and brings it back and of course wrecks the country just like Lenin wrecked Russia. But let's get back to your slides here.
Sure. Let's see here. Had to enlarge it so my aging eyes can see that. This one struck home for me. Overregulated, burned by high taxes. And this is something that I see as the economics guy around here. There's taxation, and then there's taxation by regulation as well. And I also see this in modern day America as an organization, weaponized way of concentrating power with large corporations to stifle competition. And the example I use of that is my wife recently retired, and we owned a business for a while, a couple decades. And it would have been, we had, I'll just call it 10,000 square foot store. And we could have easily, but if we had the power, we could have said, well, we need a regulation that any new store needs to be at least 9,500 square feet. And if we had the power, make that into a regulation and therefore stifle the competition. So this is another way I see modern, the political system and corporations working together against the hierarchy. Any thoughts on that, Mr. Tanner?
Yeah, I forget where I read it, but one great line is that the real enemy of tradition and aristocracy is taxes. I forget if I brought it up in this Rhodesia article, but I've brought it up before. Harold Wilson, who was the British prime minister largely throughout Ian Smith's tenure, he's the one who destroyed Rhodesia, at least from the British side of things. He's also the one who raised death taxes in the country. They call them death duties there, to 90%. There are some ways to avoid that with complex trusts and things, but largely it really wiped out the aristocracy because you can't pass anything on, particularly if it's an illiquid asset like land or a big country house, that if it's taxed at 90%, it's just impossible. But that also applies to normal people. All these systems are complex. There's a reason that village life revolved around the manor there, or that here in America you have just old families doing things, whether it's owning farmland or kind of controlling things in a town through owning the key businesses, but it's wiped away by taxation. And so instead of that, which has its downsides, I'm not saying it's perfect. It obviously has many flaws, and there are corrupt people, and all the usual things apply where you don't want anything to be so rigid as to be inflexible. But when you replace that, you don't get communist nirvana when you wipe every tradition away with taxes. Instead, you just get corporations doing the same thing, but those entities are much more impersonal and much worse So instead of having someone who's been in the town for 300 years trying to control things and stop it from turning to just dust, you get some corporation or some private equity firm squeezing every last drop of life out of the place. And regulation helps them do that because they can avoid, or they can pay the regulatory costs in a way that small businesses or just a family can't. So I think it's just all combined, whether it's the actual taxes, the income taxes, the death taxes, the regulations. It disempowers people who are tied to a place and empowers ruthless corporations and freebooting private equity types. It's just the worst possible outcome is what regulation of this sort creates.
Well, and that was a wonderful segue into the next slide. Well done, Mr. Tanner. Again, from your article, talking about the unearned capital gains tax. This is one that drives me crazy because it's a math problem. And my calculator has never once lied to me. So right now, of course, what's being proposed is only those with greater than $100 million in assets would pay a percentage of their unrealized capital gains each year. And that would be, I'll just say generically 20% tax for something held longer than a year. Well, it doesn't take much of a historian to understand that that's where it starts at. And we can look back in 1913, the 16th Amendment. It was the income tax here in the U.S. Initially, that was 1% tax on incomes above $3,000. That's about $96,000 today. And 7% tax on income above $500,000, which is about $16 million today, which, of course, at the time was like, yeah, sure, get those rich people. Well, how's that shaking out for us? So there's no reason we should believe the unrealized capital gains tax won't follow the same trajectory over time. And as the grown-ups in the room, I think it's incumbent upon us to say, well, hold on a second here. This is not how it's going to turn out in a couple of generations. And I care about my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. So, and there was also the same thing for the alternative minimum tax. That was originally just going after 155 people. And now it's, after this, the Trump tax cuts go away, they think in 2027, if you go to the next slide there, Rich, my memory isn't what it used to be. In 2026, rather, it's going to go back to affecting 7 million people. So we're going to go from 155 to 7 million. So again, going to your point, Mr. Tanner, about how these regulations make it hard to build wealth and move up a society and disillusion people. This is another example of that.
Right. And it also, one of the problems with mass democracy, it's really the biggest problem I have, is that it continually eats the seed corn because it has trouble thinking about the day after tomorrow. And death taxes and alternative minimum taxes and unrealized capital gains taxes are the best example of that. Most of our wealth and prosperity is built on centuries of heavy investment into everything, whether it's farming and rural life or skyscrapers and city life. That required a lot of investment, and a lot of it is held as an unrealized gain because it's just, the step up in basis when you die and pass it on. And people who are wealthy enough to do that sort of thing are wealthy enough and smart enough to create things like dynasty trusts where it's never really taxed at a nominal level. If you create an unrealized capital gains tax, even if it never went below the $100 billion mark that they say, that would destroy everything because of the constant selling pressure it creates. If every year 25% of something has to be turned over, most things are illiquid assets, whether it's land, whether it's a private company, whether it's anything that's not just publicly traded. It's hard to sell those things. There's a lot of transaction costs and friction involved in selling them. And there just won't be the money to buy and sell anything anymore because it'll just be a disaster. It'd be eating the seed corn of our prosperity, which is probably what they want. I think they want to destroy everything, and that's why they push just insanity like this. It's why they put 90% death taxes on things in England. They wanted to destroy traditional society. And the result of that is now it's flooded with Pakistanis that sexually abuse little girls. It's, yeah.
Will?
Oh, yep. Sorry about that. I'm losing power here in a few minutes. I was trying to switch over to hotspotting my phone while I was doing that. Sorry about that.
Oh, you're good.
No worries, brother.
So, I see that also, when people talk about inheritance taxes, you get if you don't have a step up basis, then when someone inherits something in California where, mom and dad bought the house in 1965 and now it's worth, $2 million. the capital
You
gains
might want
on
to turn
that,
your
if
video
there's a
off since you're
separate basis.
hotspotting. Your audio's cutting in and out. I
Okay.
think there's too much. If you turned off your video, that might help with making the audio go through. Sorry to interrupt. It's just it's hard to hear.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you. Let's see here. Now let's just pretend I don't know how to do that.
It should be stop cam down if you go down towards the bottom middle of your screen and then over to the left.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
There you go.
Glad you're here to bail me out, sir. We see that when there was the proposals in California to get rid of the step basis for real estate, because the kids would have to sell the house that mom and dad bought back in 1965 because there's so much gain there. The only way they can unlock the money to pay the taxes, all the property. Well, also a lot of property hitting the property down the values, which hurts everything.
Yeah, you were breaking up, but I think we got you there. Will.
Okay.
And
right. If it continues, I'll just step aside.
Okay. And Craig brings up what says, never forget rich people want the poor to stay poor, so they will work harder and stay loyal.
Yeah, definitely true. Yeah, I think that's what you see. I just the constant regulation makes it harder to rise out of any position, and I think that really is what the plutocrats want, where they want wage slaves and their horrible factories forever.
Yeah, and if you look at pre-Civil War U.S., the idea of the Industrial Revolution brought upon the idea of wage workers, which is something that was somewhat anathema to pre-industrial America. And there was a lot of pushback and a lot of problems that I think was one of the contributing factors potentially to the Civil War here. And I think I'll kind of finish with that question, Will. Okay. There has been talk of another civil war in America. Is this something that is hyperbole or something that could be a reasonable course of action if things don't change?
I think it's largely wish casting by people who are unhappy with their personal situation. There's a lot of tension and unpleasantness in America. The problem is that no one had kids, so it's too old, or some people had kids, obviously, but largely people didn't have kids, or at least have enough kids for us to be a young population rather than an aging population. And you just don't see civil wars in old populations. No 60-year-old's going to go sit in a foxhole or rebel. Most people just want their 401ks to continue going up. They might be unhappy with how things are going, but civil wars only happen when the population is quite youthful. So no, I don't think there will be a civil war. I think we'll either just see things, someone like if Trump wins and puts Elon Musk in power and 80% of the federal workforce is cut and regulations are wiped away, where America now looks like America of 1900, that would be a change of pace that would help America. If it doesn't happen, then we'll just continue seeing slow decay and decline. I don't think civil war is in the cards.
What do you see if there is something kinetic in our future? Is it China, Russia, external threats that do concern you? Is there anything out there, Mr. Tanner?
It's difficult. I think things could always blow up in the Middle East. It's hard to predict people who are unreasonable, what they'll do. And I think a lot of things that happen there happen just because the sides are unreasonable and won't come to an agreement. The Chinese and Russians are more willing to make reasonable decisions, however, and Russia has its war in Ukraine. China just doesn't have the equipment to land a force of men in Taiwan and take it over. They don't have the landing craft. They don't have the ships. They don't have the helicopters. They don't have the planes. They have a lot of equipment, but not enough to invade Taiwan. If you look at the American military's war plans from World War II, what it would need, even assuming modern technology obviates the need for a lot of that stuff, you still need some of it, and they just don't have it. So I don't think an invasion of Taiwan that blows up into World War III is in the cards. I think what you will see is more of South Africa style, just chaos and violence in a lot of the world. You won't have a civil war, but I think when you have gangs of people like that gang in Aurora, Colorado, that are taking over apartment buildings, that doesn't stay peaceful and just happening forever. There's pushback there, and that kind of flares up and flares down. You see that in South Africa. I think you'll see that in America, where it just doesn't work out long term.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think we're headed more toward South Africa than Rhodesia. We have a lot of our members where self-preservation community, whatever you want to call it. We have the American Warrior Society. We give you access to self-defense training. Will said he'll be dead in 20 minutes. Well, thank you for being on today, Will. God bless, brother.
Yeah, I'll stay on here until my computer battery dies, but it's
okay.
The clock is ticking.
Your audio. If I could add one thing,
yes, please.
Since this is a self-defense podcast, largely, people should read about the Bush War, and you should particularly read about what happened to the Rhodesian farmers during the war. Mm-hmm. They were isolated farming communities. They had their laborers, so it wasn't like it was two people in the woods generally. But they were isolated, and so the rebels, the infiltrating communists, could surround and attack them and try to kill them. Often they were unsuccessful because the rebels were incompetent and the farmers were competent. But still, it was a problem. And for survival, they relied on relief columns of the militarized police force or second-tier units coming to their rescue and fighting off the rebels as they stayed in their bunkers and tried to survive. A lot of the American self-defense and survival community has the individual bent where they want to be the lone guy in the woods with a rifle rather than part of a community. And Rhodesia shows that doesn't work, because if it ever happens in America, you're not going to have a relief column coming to your rescue.
No, you're absolutely right. We've talked about that extensively on the show. There's so many lessons to learn. And I live on a farm here in Tennessee, and the lessons of the Rhodesian farmers are things that I've put in place here on our little farm in Tennessee. But to your point, what I was getting at with this, we have a lot of members who are in South Africa, and I've interviewed them. And one of them is a corporate attorney, and I had him on here, and he's like, look, Rich, these laws, they just disenfranchise the poor blacks here. He's like, I'm a corporate attorney. I do nothing all day long but write papers, whatever. I'm not an attorney, so I don't know what he's talking about. His words was legal briefs. And he said, this is like, every year I have to do like 2 inches thick of paperwork just to keep my concealed carry license here in South Africa. He goes, I have the time, the wherewithal, the intellect, the computer, the printer to do that. So I do it. It's not a problem for me. It's a problem for the poor blacks that don't have that, because part of the Rainbow Coalition that came in with Mandela and destroyed the police force, the original defund the police movement. Now it goes, I live inside a walled community with other wealthy people. I have ex-South African special forces guys that ride around in bearcats to protect us all day long. They don't have that. So again, it's one of those things where, like we see in the communities that need the police the most here in America, with this defund the police Marxist movement, you're really only hurting the most vulnerable people. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mr. Tanner?
Defunding the police is internal decolonization. And when you read about them supporting the Simbas in the Congo, or supporting the Mugabeites and Nkomoites in Rhodesia, or supporting the ANC communists in South Africa, or supporting the communists in Angola and Mozambique, the list can go on and on and on. They're always supporting the decolonizers. And what those decolonizers do when they get in charge is expropriation and terror and genocide. And that's what they want to do here. We're what they want to decolonize. And what we saw with decolonization is it doesn't only hurt the top couple white percent, or the successful businessmen and that sort of people, though they're often hurt by it. It also eviscerates the bottom part of the population that can no longer survive. Civilization is a good thing. Medicine, prosperity, just everything we rely upon, that's wiped away with decolonization. And so those who suffer the most are those at the bottom who couldn't afford the generators, couldn't afford the water purifiers, and now they have nothing on which to rely other than just hoping they survive.
Yeah, here on the Cumberland Plateau, I got to thinking about this. We have a group, a nonprofit, amazing group. I think they're called Pace Setters, and they take intellectually disabled adults, and they will take them to Walmart and take them to get lunch and just get them out in the community, and they'll do arts and crafts, whatever. It's a beautiful thing, right? And I saw these 2 women who were the chaperones for this group of adults. Again, I want them to have their autonomy as much as possible. But if you get them in the truck and it's like, all right, guys, it's time to have lunch. Where do you want to go? They want to get, cotton candy and all these other things. It's not healthy for them. So I think that governance that says, yeah, that sounds great, but let's go ahead and we're going to have some vegetables today. We're not going to eat cotton candy. So again, this idea of, if everybody on that bus got a vote, it would be cotton candy every day or whatever. I mean, because again, like you said, they eat the seed corn. One of your recommendations, I heard you on another podcast, Mr. Tanner. You said The Empire of Dust. I had never heard of this.
Oh yeah, that's a documentary about the Belgian or the post-Belgian Congo. It's I think it was in 2011. The Chinese sent this guy. I don't remember if it was part of the Belt and Road Initiative or just general investment in infrastructure. They sent this Chinese guy to build a road in the Congo, and he gets there and he's horrified because the natives have just let everything rot since the Belgians left. So what was high tech in the 60s is now just decayed and falling apart. And the Chinese guy, I think his name is Yang or something, makes the point. He says, you should have learned from the Belgians. They were here. They weren't here just exclusively to help you, but they did help you. And they built these things and they showed you how to use them. And then when they left, you stopped maintaining everything and didn't learn anything. And so it fell apart. And The Empire of Dust is a great documentary.
It's a fantastic one. Thank you so much for that recommendation. I highly recommend it to folks just to wrap your head around, because the Chinese, he's talking to his interpreter, who is a local Congolese gentleman, and he's like, "You see that railroad? Do you realize how hard it is to build a railroad?" and of course they don't get it. So anyway, where can folks find you, Will? Thank you for coming on the show today. I would really love a round two when we don't plagued with these technical difficulties we've had. I apologize.
Yeah, I'm happy to come on whenever. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Will_Tanner_1 is my handle on there. And then I mainly write about this sort of thing on our Substack, which is theamericantribune.news.
Well, thank you so much for being on today. Mr. Wood, sir, any final comments from you? And again, we may have lost Will. So thank you so much. If you're listening to the podcast, please like and share this content. Please take an opportunity to read some of the books that are going to be referenced. Some of Will's articles are going to be referenced in there. You're going to have an opportunity to take advantage of all that stuff and learn more about what might be in store for us here in the good old US of A.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tanner, for being on today.
Thank you for having me on. See you soon.
Yes, sir.